I hate cleaning out sheds, but something you got to do. Cleaning out sheds is sort of like cleaning out our vocabulary. Words are abstract symbols, and because of that, they can be moved and changed, and they can be adapted. They adapt themselves in a lot of ways to situations around them. So while they're context-based, they're still abstract. And depending upon maybe the mood that that word is associated with, or the meaning, the logical consequences of that word coming into actual ontological action, um, determine its use in terms of its meaning. And so that's what we're going to look at the word indigeneity today to try to understand it a little bit more. Uh, Indigeneity is a complicated word. It can mean a lot of things to different people. Today, it's a popular term. It's almost become a brand name for people who have Indigenous heritage, who are referred to as Aboriginal in this country, who may be referred to as First Nations. All of these terms are kind of quasi-acceptable because generally the identity which is trying to be described through various words finds itself in a colonial matrix, in a matrix in which it is to be Indigenous, to be Indian, to be Aboriginal, to be First Nations, to be Native. All of those terms place the people who are named by those terms in a lower social economic category. And that provides a great deal of problems for those who might want to use those words. The words also connote dependency and poverty. So while they also have a meaning that is useful as well, the contemporary use of the term Indigenous is really an ideological term. It attempts to create a more acceptable label, brand name for Aboriginal people. Even Aboriginal people themselves accept this because Indigenous sounds better than the term Aboriginal. Aboriginal has come to refer to the relationship with the state, the colonial relationship with the state. You know, at first we were very happy to use the term Aboriginal because it was associated with the rights-based discourse. It was associated with the recognition under the Canadian Constitution in 1982 that there was a thing called Aboriginal rights, and they were recognized within the national Constitution. That was a big political step forward. But it wasn't quite enough because it really didn't change policy and practice on the part of the government. What it meant was that each and every time those rights needed to be affirmed or tested, that First Nations would have to go to court and finally work their way up through the Supreme Court for a constitutional decision. Well, when people began to think about other words that might describe who people of Indigenous ancestry in Canada are, they began using the term First Nations. Well, First Nations, you know, was coined around the period of time in which uh, the Constitution was being negotiated, and it was one of those terms that could have been used instead of Aboriginal, First Nations rights. But the federal government could never bring themselves to using that term because it asserted a political position of being first, the First Nation within the places of Canada, or the First Nations, I should say. Well, that never sat well with the federal government or the provinces. Uh, and thinking of Aboriginal people or people of Indigenous heritage as being nations was also not acceptable in terms of the colonial ideology that runs this country. So it was rejected to the term Aboriginal. Now, some people don't like the term Aboriginal because they think of that term being aboriginal or against or the antithesis of original. Well, that's not what the ab means there, but um, it's certainly taken that way. And the very fact that it represents a clear legal relationship with the colonial state and all of the dependencies that come with that, it has been soundly rejected. And the term indigenous became popular really recently. And indigenous kind of goes back to that idea of First Nations, the fact that indigeneity means being first, uh, being attached to the ground, and in some ways being attached to the ecology. In order to understand indigeneity in a modern context, it's important to take a look at the authors that have thought about it deeply and written about indigeneity. Uh, they don't all agree. Um, they, in fact, they define indigeneity in abstract ways that are pretty divergent from one another. And so that's why the three readings that I've chosen for this week, um, I want you to read because they don't all say the same thing. They're not like reading the same ideas over and over again, which is what we get when we listen to the news on CBC or the radio at large. And yes, I do hate cleaning out the shed, but cleaning out our vocabulary, understanding what we've got, what we want to keep, what's a nuisance if we keep it and we really should throw it out or change it. How much this stuff is going to go back into the shed, who knows. But when I'm done, I'm going to be able to walk into this shed and use it efficiently and practically, and I'll know what I'm doing when I'm in there instead of stumbling over and trying to figure out what kind of tools to take out and what kind of equipment to move out of the way and store here and there. Anyway, that's why we make this type of analysis first when we're beginning theory, because it's really important to have your tools lined up properly. In the reading by Alfred and Corntassel, there's a quote that says that there may not be a clear definition for the word indigeneity, and that, the debate about a definition may be actually more interesting than a definition itself. Well, I think that's okay. This course will, in some ways, develop a broad definition, an active definition, an ontological definition of the term Indigenous and how it describes the conditions and the cultures that people live. Well, the term indigenous is interesting because it goes back a long ways. It has some roots. Uh, for instance, the term indigenous itself, as we use it in English, is made up of a Latin word and an Arabic word. Um, Indo, which in Latin means within, and jinn is a Arabic word that in Arabic cosmology refers to the spirits, the essential spirits of uh, the heavens that we don't see, and also the spirits of the things that we do see. So, for instance, in Anishinaabemowin, the language the language uses the term Manitou, and a spirit, a Manitou, is that essential spirit of a species, uh, of a group of entities that have a clear affinity. For instance, there would be a human Manitou, there would be a fox Manitou, a bear Manitou. In this way, and even within the plant world, the pines, the oaks, all of those would have an essential spirit which would define it. And this was probably used because before the knowledge of genetics, there was a recognition that there was a sameness, a pattern, um, a theme that would carry through particular groups. For instance, all bears look and move and operate in many of the same ways, mostly the same ways. And it's true for a family, a human family, where there's a recognition that people look alike, that they share outward characteristics, but they also share maybe attitudes, and they share abilities that are similar. And in that way, the idea of jinn arose as a way of recognizing those similarities and assigning some sort of causality to it. So that's not to say that the idea of jinn, just because we have a lot more knowledge about how the mechanisms of genetics works, it doesn't mean that the idea of jinn is also thrown out, because in many people's minds, those two things can work simultaneously together. So that again makes a definition of this term indigenous difficult. The other thing is that there are other words that try to express the same thing. For instance, the word autochthonous is a Greek word that was used in Athenian times during the Athenian civilization. And basically, autochthonous was the word that was referred to, or the quality of life that was referred to those who were originally from Athens or the area around Athens. And what it basically means is that those who sprang from the ground. Now that's very close to the word indigenous in many ways. But I have a problem with autochthonous because it refers to Athenian citizenship and is exclusive to a kind of civic definition. And for instance, it's exclusive. It excludes merchants and craftsmen who might have been drawn to Athens to work and to live. It also excludes the slaves who were considered non-humans in a way, who worked for and provided the power and energy for the development of Athens. And it did not take into consideration their roots and origins as potentially being indigenous. In the book Political Identity, Tayaki Alfred and Jeff Korntassel contribute a chapter called Being Indigenous, Resurgences Against Contemporary Colonialism. And their thesis basically is caught in the first sentence, or first couple of sentences of what they write. They say this: Indigenous is an identity constructed, shaped, and lived in the politicized context of contemporary colonialism. The communities, clans, nations, and tribes we call indigenous people are just that, indigenous to the lands they inhabit, in contrast to and in contention with the colonial societies and states that have spread out from Europe and other centers of empire. Well, basically what they say here is that there's a binary, that there are indigenous people and not indigenous people. And those people who are not indigenous are people who are the descendants of those from other places that colonized the indigenous people's homelands. This is a rather, I think, narrow definition, but along the way, I think Alfred and Corntassel would agree with me in that they begin to condition their ideology around this binary. For instance, they say that if a person does not necessarily live on their lands anymore, but speaks their language or attempts to develop a cultural understanding, a renewed cultural understanding of their heritage, or that they have a spiritual relationship with the land that their ancestors once occupied. These are conditions that they would perhaps see as a resurgence and a move toward re-indigenization. And in that way, they could perhaps call themselves indigenous peoples. So, one of the problems with binaries is that they're really established on a process of creating extremes, but they never really measure what's in the middle. And when we look at contemporary Canada, we see a whole lot of people in the middle. We see people who live in or near their traditional territories on reserve, but we also see a whole bunch of people who are urbanized. In fact, by the year 2000, Aboriginal people, 50% of Aboriginal people in Canada had become urbanized, and it's even greater since then. Alfred and Corntassel do make some really important statements, though. They look at that process of resurgence. What does it mean? It means to have a relationship with the land. It means to have a language that expresses the ecology of the land. It means having a community that identifies you as a member, where your identity is not something that you establish yourself. Also a spiritual connection to ceremonies that ancestors may have used. That can be contested as well, but I want you to read the article, take as much out of it as you can. I do want to leave you with one point, because I think when we make this point, we move on to the next article, and that is found here on 605, page 605. They write this. This is a recognition that our true power as Indigenous people ultimately lies in our relations and our relationships with our land, relatives, language, and ceremonial life. Now, what's missing? What's missing here in my mind, as I understand indigeneity, or the qualities of Indigenous life, is they're missing the means of production. The means of production in the hands of those indigenous people ensures that they can produce food, that they can produce shelter, that they can produce the clothing that they wear and the crafts that they make, and also they can provide protection for themselves. And these are essential to successful indigenous living and adaptation. The article Being in Being, Contesting the Ontopolitics of Indigeneity is a really interesting article. It develops a wide scope and offers us commentary from a number of different sources who have thought deeply about how indigeneity is working in the real world. That is, in the neoliberal, globalized world that you and I know today. And their first sentence as well reflects a reality that often, because we're immersed in neoliberal globalization, we miss altogether. Let me just read their introductory statement. Throughout the history of colonialism, competing representations of the indigenous have been deployed, that's a good word, deployed by the colonial powers to have their own advantage and ends. Now, this just didn't spring up in the colonization of the Americas or Asia or any other place over the last 300 or 400 years. This idea of indigenous resistance being met by the ruling elites and becoming stronger and stronger each time they encounter, overcome, and defeat a form of indigenous resistance, that the elites actually become stronger in terms of redefining what indigeneity is, in terms of redefining the relationship between either mercantilism or capitalism and the indigenous inhabitants of the earth. So they're offering us nothing new here, but they are offering us very contemporary understandings. Let me give you one as an example that they don't cover. The UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People was something that we struggled really hard to have our nation of Canada accept and recognize. Well, they finally did recognize it. It was a UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. They refused to sign on to it because the Harper government originally said, well, we can look at it as a document that it might be good in the future, but it's not consistent with our Constitution, as though the Constitution was the last word for all time. And in that respect, it was just an aspiration that they signed on to. But the document itself is problematic in that it supports globalization. It supports neoliberal political domination over all other forms of human expression. In that, it places indigenous people in a protected cocoon. It identifies them, says land, relationships, language, history, ancestry, all of these define indigenous life. But they also begin a process of indigenous people having to essentialize themselves, to say, this is our spirituality, this is our history, this is our ancestry, this is our blood quantum. All of that information begins to essentialize and compartmentalize the indigenous. It locks indigenous people into a kind of forever cocoon that they can never escape from. And they can never really return to indigenous ways of life. So the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People falls into the rights discourse of neoliberal politics. Now, they don't use that example, but they use, Julian and Reed use or Chandler and Reed use a number of examples and theoretical examples that help us understand this process and how it works. And their main concern is pointing out that the neoliberal politics is under a great threat right now. It's under a threat of itself because it has reached limitations. It's reached ecological limitations. It's reached resource limitations. It's reached the limitations of energy. And because of that, it is beginning around the world to erode and potentially collapse. And so what they suggest is that the neoliberal politic has sort of appropriated the idea of indigeneity as a form of renewal. Now, they're not just talking about the Western world this is going on, but failed states like the Soviet Union, which is now references itself as Russia, is very heavily into this process of recreating or re-indigenizing places within the immense territory of Russia, particularly to re-indigenize the Eurasian steppe as the seedbed of its cultural vitality. And so appropriating, using the aspects of indigenous knowledge or indigenous cultural development are measures that are being appropriated and used. So that's what this article is really about, and it's really excellent at formulating this and helping us understand these aspects of how indigeneity is now being defined in such a way that it's useful, extremely useful to the oppressor. I just think that the ending paragraph of this is extremely important. I just read it, and but of course you're going to read the whole thing. Here we go. Chandler and Reed say this. The ontopolitical ethics of the Anthropocene parasitically feed off the crisis of the human and social sciences, built on the fragile grounds of the long-dead modernist subject of Lockean possessive individualism. The upshot of this shift is that we should either construct a new vision of the human subject, one that is capable of resisting and creating a world fit for humanity, or consign ourselves to new forms of neoliberal dependency based on the myth of indigenous resilience. The final article is by Richard Day and me. It's a conversation between two friends. Richard has always been interested in social autonomy, and he invited me to write this with him, and we quickly decided that because we had such divergent views, in fact we were speaking from really two different places, and in some ways two different identities, we would not necessarily co-write it, but we would write it as a conversation. And in some ways that worked, in some ways it resulted in a bit of a disjointed conversation, but I think we accomplished a legitimate discussion here. We entitled it Decolonization is Not an Event. And of course, that's a bit of a play on the Tuck and Yang article, Decolonization is Not a Metaphor. Clearly, we use metaphors to describe theoretical situations which are not necessarily found in a practical sense. And in many ways, that's what we're working with here in terms of trying to define what indigeneity is or what social autonomy is. Richard's emphasis is on working toward a kind of social autonomy where people can opt in and see the betterment of humanity through ways that we govern ourselves, the economic means that we provision ourselves, the relationships that we have with one another in terms of gender, in terms of acceptance of the variety of human traits that are expressed in real life. And I have a lot of admiration for that point of view. Richard takes the step and says, I may not become indigenous, but somehow we have to return to the roots of our existence that are beyond and an improvement upon the accident of our birth within a settler population. And he calls that a political ethic, that ethics above morals, in this case, direct us in the right direction. On the other hand, I'm afraid I'm a bit pessimistic in this regard, in that I don't see a form of re-indigenization or decolonization as a constructive process. I see it more as an emergent process, and that the enlightenment or the realization that an individual or a group of individuals make and move toward that direction comes from their intersections of biology, culture, and the environment that's around us. And I try to explain that in maybe in metaphorical terms of sorts, that we needn't be afraid of making mistakes, that we're going to make mistakes, that none of us know what re-indigenization means. In fact, I've written before, and you may have seen that in the original piece that I had you read for this course, that re-indigenization may be something that's forced upon us. It's something that we have to contend with. And like lemmings, many human beings may escape or try to escape that realization and run off the proverbial cliff, while a few remain and are able to readapt to the real world that's around us. Well, that's what this article is all about. I think the insights that Richard has about social autonomy are extremely important. They're important for Aboriginal people to know about, or people of Indigenous heritage, but they're extremely important for people who have grown up within what's known as the settler society. So listen to both voices. Compare them, contrast them, and learn from them. So those are the articles for this week. Coming week 2, and it's a lot of reading. It'll take you about 4 hours to cut through all of it. Take notes, and then turn to the discussion page for week 2. And I'm going to post some questions. In fact, I have some of those questions here that I thought were important. Is identity a kind of property? Has it become property within the larger society? Is it important to have a cultural identity in today's world? I used to ask students, tell me what a Canadian is, and they might rattle off two or three things like Molson's beer, hockey, the maple leaf. But in terms of really defining what Canadian means, it was pretty difficult. Try that. Try that on for yourself. How broad or narrow should a definition of Indigenous be? And why should it be broader? Why should it be narrow? And those are questions that you may want to deal with in the discussion forum. Is bringing the term Indigenous into a contemporary political discussion legitimate? For instance, why is it that Jeff Corntassel and Tayaki Alford politicize the term Indigenous when, in fact, when we look back in time or we look across the globe at existing Indigenous peoples, the idea of politics is not a strong one. Egalitarianism is really the rule within many, many Indigenous societies. Indigenous as a concept is constructed by observers on the outside. And so Indigenous people themselves do not refer to themselves as Indigenous. That's a concept. They refer to themselves as the principal people, Aniyawiwa, Anishinaabe, which means human beings. They refer to themselves as the description of the Jinn. And I think that's important. Can this ever be a constructive discussion? And I guess so, because we're going to turn to the discussion forum and try to not come up with an answer, but at least explore the possibilities, explore the parameters of the subject of this course. So, good reading, and I'm looking forward to a very lively discussion that everyone has an opportunity to contribute to. There, a clean workshop, a clean shed. Every now and then we have to clean things up. And language is no different. So what we're going to try to do is not necessarily get on the same page with the language, but at least try to understand what each of us are talking about when we use particular words in this course, like Indigenous, like Aboriginal, like primitive, like modern. What do those words mean, and how are we going to use them? And are we going to use them for analysis, or are we going to use them for political means, or are we going to use them for resolving disputes? Whatever the case, it's really important for us to know that we've got a clean workshop.